But in terms of inherent characteristics of the work, there is a good case to be made that he's a global novelist as well. Same thing, Gunter Grass, we think, okay, it's a global novel, but Thomas Bernhard, not so much. La Kundera, yes, Danny Lokesh, not so much. The judgment is not really based on the inherent characteristics of the work. I think it's based on where the reader is and where the work is coming from and how it's being presented. And I think from the publisher's point of view and the entire delivery mechanism's point of view, certain works get picked as somehow being more accessible to people from elsewhere, and that gets marketed or packaged as global, which is not to say that other works from that place, if it were available in a language that the people can access, would or should not be of interest to them. So I think the more energetic readers will often use the book that has been marketed as an entry point into that new language or culture, and then go on to discover other works. But many others will stay confined to what's been made more easily available.
Samia, as an academic who teaches the modern novel, do you, as a teacher, think in terms of the global novel, and do your students receive it in that way, or are those definitions meaningless?
Actually, I just want to agree with the two speakers that who is deciding on the terminology, on the framing, global, and it's obviously not us from the South, somebody else. And what are the politics behind this kind of framing, and who is trying to achieve what in speaking about the global novel, when indeed the novel has always existed, has always circulated between cultures, etc. But I also want to think about, what would make a novel global? What are the characteristics of that novel? Is it the language? Is it the content? Is it, what is it that would render a novel global? And I want to speak to the moment that we are going through in Egypt, for example, with language in particular, and how the uprising, the January uprising, has propelled the vernacular into the literary scene. It has spoken Arabic rather than classical Arabic, for example. And how, over the past 3 years, but not just the 3 years, let's say the second half of the 20th century into the 21st, writers have been carving a new language that is spoken and local, right? And that challenges translation and translators in many ways. And because of that, many of these writers, younger writers, have indeed not been translated into English, the Esperanto language, have not been able to accede to this global map, literary map. So, looking at the literary scene in Egypt today, one would have to say that we perhaps are not interested in becoming part of that global, and it's sort of imposed by an other on that. We are simply not interested because the literary reality, the literary language, the literary moment and history is such that writers are engaged in carving a local moment, historical, literary moment.
And do they get, when you talk about a local literary moment, is there a sense, or even an impetus to want that? I don't mean translated into English, but I mean translated to a wider audience, or is it something that the people that you're talking about are quite happy to keep local?
Of course, everybody wants to be translated, right? But then, let me give you an example of politics of translation, also from Lebanon. That you really need to fit into a particular framework that is acceptable to that that global market. And I vividly recall a text by Hamid, who is a Lebanese writer, who, when translated into English, that particular text was actually completely restructured. And that was recommended by the editor because it was more readable to a global audience once restructured. And when I'm talking about a text that was really divided into four parts, narratives, and you could, at least the editor felt, that they could fiddle around with the order of these four narrative segments. But in doing so, they actually transformed the very meaning of the text and its signification and what the readership would actually take away from it. And it was only then that the text could accede to that global stage and become readable once packaged, repackaged that way.
Hugh, Eakin, as a critic, what does all of this debate mean to you? How does it inform the choices that you make in terms of what will be given prominence in terms of reviewing or focus?
Well, I want to start with Samia's excellent point about whether or not people are participating in whatever this is that we're calling the global novel, because I think it's interesting to think that there's a choice on the part of a literary community not to take part. I'm thinking of what's imposed by the market from the other side, and rather than a global novel, we might want to be thinking of an asymmetry between an English language dominant kind of literary critical culture and the actual literary world, which is in many ways not English. And I think this is easier to see when you look at European literature and smaller countries. Fascinating fact that I learned recently in Holland, the Netherlands, 50 years ago, about 5%, I think, of the book market was works in translation, translated into Dutch. Today, it is for fiction, for literary fiction, it's nearly 70%. Which, if you think, so what is left then of the native Dutch writing market? And are Dutch writers writing anymore for their national audience, or is it very much that you have to be now part of this international translatable idiom that can sell overseas? And conversely, on the U.S. side, everybody's probably aware of that we're still at that mark of 5% that the Dutch were 50 years ago, and I don't think it's going to. We're actually, I think for works of literature and poetry, it's less than 1% of the book market is works translated into English and sold in the U.S. So you have this kind of dominance imposed in part by the size of the Anglo-American market that I think has a very large effect on what we're talking about, and maybe that is something we should think about. So I think it's difficult to sort of address these questions without sort of taking into consideration these forces that are reshaping the literary marketplace.
We can talk about it, but given that we've got writers on the panel, I wonder whether we can look at the impact that it makes on you as a novelist, for example, Mohsin. I mean, are you informed by the sorts of forces that Hugh's talking about that shape the market? I mean, Tim Parks wrote an article recently talking about how the way in which writers, many very well-known writers, was a charge that he levelled at people like Kazuo Ishiguro and Umberto Eco and Salman Rushdie, that somehow they write a kind of English that is, or they'll write a kind of fiction that is easily translatable, that is internationally translatable, if you like, that is actually making an impact on the creative choices that a novelist makes.
It might well be. I mean, as a writer, it's very hard to know what's going on, in the black box of the creative process. It might be the case that many writers are, trying to write stuff which they think will sell. It probably has always been the case that, Shakespeare, one of that did that, wanted to pack the hall. He would have been disappointed. He didn't have a full crowd at 10 in the morning. So I think the response to a market imperative has sort of always been there. It's usually not a considered response. I don't think, I'm a big fan of Ishiguro's. It's hard for me to imagine Ishiguro sitting there and saying, okay, the whole thing worked really well with these, transplant type, creatures in some sci-fi universe, and I stripped down English parable language. I'm now going to try the negative. The next big thing is the environment. So I'm going to do some funky, butler. Anyway, so I don't see writers thinking in that way that much. But in a pernicious way, of course, this stuff is going to happen. And it may be that we shouldn't even be so concerned about it happening, because writers are just reflecting what's happening in society around them. In other words, writers are not sitting hermits, remotely isolated from the world, creating their works. The changing world of publishing is such that now writers are expected to come to literary festivals, to go on Twitter, to get on Facebook, to do promotions, to do all kinds of stuff, part of a publishing enterprise, which is becoming like this. And personally, sometimes I do, people ask me, what's your job? And I say, well, I'm kind of unemployed. I sit around doing nothing, and occasionally I write. But at other times, I think, I'm kind of a multinational corporation with tiny sales in lots of different territories, but like my tentacles are everywhere. So the Bulgarians, buy 100 of my books, my little Bulgarian operation. And I think in some ways it is becoming a little bit like that.
But what does it do? I'm intrigued to hear you say that it's true that writers might be informed by that. But what does that do to the imaginative space that we hold as sacred, if you like?
Well I think that there are different imaginative spaces. There is, for example, a political space, which is also an imaginative space. And living in Pakistan is something that I certainly deal with, and I think many writers deal with. The immediate context in which you find yourself. What is sayable? What is not sayable? What narratives are people trying to say are the truth, which you can possibly rebut through fiction? It's a kind of political imagination. There's a, for want of a better word, there's a kind of interior imagination, which is part of being a writer. I think for me is sitting quietly by yourself doing nothing for hours. You just sit there, all day, and you're sitting in a room by yourself, looking at sort of nothing. And then stuff starts to well up, and that stuff is part of the imaginative process. It's different from, what relates to the political thing. All of these things are happening simultaneously, and so, no doubt, these kind of market imperatives and whatnot are hitting writers. But I think it's very difficult to generalize about what that effect has, what that radiation does on writers as a whole. But one thing I would like to say is that I find the term very interesting, global. When you ask what's it doing to a writer. Presumably the global novel means the novelist is being globalized. And globalization now, I think, stands for something quite bad in much of the world. That global is not good. So I think this whole conversation for me has within it the fear of contamination that is running rampant in our world. That we think that all of us are being contaminated by outside influences. Muslims by Western values, Americans by Sharia, the Europeans by brown people, whatever it is. And so there's a concern that our artists are becoming contaminated. I tend to think that art is born from contamination, that actually contamination is the reason why we have art in the first place. So I don't think that's a bad thing, contamination. But I think the conversation that we're having, talking about global, it's really a conversation about miscegenation and artistic miscegenation.
Anis, I wonder if you can reflect on the global versus the local in the context of publishing.
I think it really comes down to how much you've sold in the end. As a writer, if a publisher and the entire critical machinery could sell 1 million copies of my book, I probably wouldn't mind whether they call me global or Martian. Short of that, at the end of the day, there's a business involved here, and people are trying to sell the book, and they'll call it what they need to make that happen. But to answer what you're asking, I would actually like to start by pointing out some contradictions of this sort of clumsy attempt at categorizing the uncategorizable, which is writing. The first contradiction is, for the longest time, the Americans or English or whoever was the global power, when their authors wrote, they really wrote for their audience. When somebody, Paul Bowles, wrote about, 3 unemployed, privileged Westerners getting lost in the Moroccan desert, they didn't really think they were writing about Morocco. It was just the background. And there's, countless examples of that sort. And even we were so grateful to be acknowledged at all in the, literary, in the written map of the world, that we still read it as if it were a book about Morocco. Paul Thoreau passes through Calcutta and writes about the Great Railway Bazaar, and we're, just so grateful that Bengal somehow showed up somewhere. So for the longest time, that was global writing, and the expectation was that people from those global margins, the actual global, apparitions, they should, when they write, they should cater to the Western audience. And that meant fitting into paradigms. And that's how a lot of global journalism is done, as you surely know. The story doesn't fit the paradigm. A lot of times they will say, people are not really interested in this. So the same thing comes down to writing. And people have this notion of what will sell. And, publishers have that notion, agents do, and some writers are willing to cater to that. And I don't blame them for it. To the extent writing has always been a commercial enterprise, we don't blame any other trade for trying to sell. If they want to write something that sells in itself, then, it's a compact between that author and his readers. That's just what it is.
So what you were describing changed radically in the kind of 1980s when what we describe as the Empire Strikes Back. A whole bunch of writers from those places then started writing about the places that they knew.
They started doing that, and the contradiction here is, manifold. First of all, I think Ishiguro's strongest novel was possibly Remains of the Day, Rushdie's Mehrez Children, which were very strongly about a place. And now they're writing these placeless novels which actually are not that compelling. I mean, they may sell because they're such big names and so on, but they're not as engaging to me. So that's one contradiction. I think this so-called global writing, like whoever's writing from anywhere in the world in any language, if they want the story to be compelling, that's one of the most fundamental things about writing from Greek classics to now. It has to be about specific places and peoples and issues. I don't think this ethereal place of ontology, occasionally it can work with a Mehrez or a Kafka if the philosophy behind it is that strong, but otherwise I don't think it works. Even more funnily, like this recent debate was kicked off by, I think, the N+1 article, which to me was sort of a very whiny article. And it basically seemed to say that these brown and other people are just getting too much attention for being brown. But white people have gotten a lot of attention for being white. You didn't complain that. You didn't complain that. So that to me is not a good criticism of the global novel. And finally, I would leave it with Morrison, establishing in England, Morrison, and they, for the longest time, used to have, in the 80s, they used to have a food aisle called foreign food. And I think we start thinking of global...
They don't call it foreign food anymore.
Foreign food of literature.
It's world food now. It's world food now. So in a way, there's a parallel in publishing.
I think we really have to look at what are the inherent characteristics of a work. Why Tolstoy or Jane Austen still appeals universally in the truest sense. And what are contemporary works that have a similar ability to connect across borders or cultures? And there are works like that. I think to come back to that aesthetic issue, the literary issue of what are the characteristics of this work would be the more interesting part of trying to figure out what novel is global or part of the world literature and so on. And the onus of figuring that out should be equally on all places. That's my main thing. I mean, I don't think Americans should just sit around and think they're writing a novel, and we should have to sit around and think we're writing a global novel. That's what I would say.
Hugh, I wonder if what informs part of what Anis is talking about is to do with who the tastemakers are. Because in a way, what we're talking about really is where power resides and who decides a particular novel is going to be given more prominence than another. Because we know that for example, where I live, in the United Kingdom, 100,000 books are published every year. So that's a tiny, tiny country, a huge amount of output. But I would say a very, very small percentage of those books are the ones that gain prominence. And all those other writers are just kind of, they carry on writing, wanting prominence. But I'm just wondering whether this is also to do with who decides which novelist is going to get the front page of the New York Review of Books, if you like.
Well, it's strange. I mean, I think that there's a marketing phenomenon that's happened over the last couple decades, or the last few years in particular, that it's harder to explain. But publishers will tell you this. I mean, it goes to the era of the huge advances to the very small. I mean, it starts before the books are written, and you have a small handful of writers now who will be simultaneously translated in many languages and released around the world. And then the sort of the traditional mid-list, serious fiction writers who have never sold in large quantities, but there's always, the serious publishing houses have always published them. Though that group is getting smaller in some sense in representation. And it's very hard to say why this is true. I mean, as the New York Review, we're trying very hard to review the most important books that we see, regardless of how well they may or may not be selling. But I think in general, you're seeing exactly what you say, that sometimes in the New York Times we'll review the same book 3 different times. And why is this happening now? It's very hard to say. But to go back to this is a question for Samia. I'm so interested in Arab literature, which is almost completely ignored in the United States, and is one reason that, in fact, the traditions and the stylistic tendencies of Arab literature are so difficult to translate. There was a beautiful novel by a young Rabi Jaber. Only one of his books has been translated, and he has written like 15 books. And I assume that the Mehrez report, it's very political and grounded in events in Lebanon in the 2000s. Was this why it was translated? But we see so little, and that was from a very small press, and I don't think it was reviewed in any of the papers. We did a piece on it, but.
Do you want to address that point, Samia?
Sure. I think there's more than one element that is responsible for the sort of absence, almost total absence, of Arab literary works on the global map. One, I think, is language. Right? I'm assuming you're not the man who writes in English, right? So it makes you immediately...
And also Bangla.
Right, you have an edge, you're already in the loop. Whereas with Arab writers, they have to be translated, and translation is expensive. I mean, we're speaking about an expensive enterprise, and publishers need to want to invest in that to begin with, and that is very hard to come by. The second element, I think, has to do with a radical change in the profile of the writers themselves. Who are these writers? where are they coming from? And I'm arguing here that writers, again, I'm going to use Egypt again as the example, are increasingly coming from the country's periphery, and that their writings are about these peripheral areas in very peripheral language, describing very peripheral and also how can I say, totally un-bourgeois, right? So for bourgeois readers, they're somewhat shocking, like social realities. And that may account also for their inability, or the unwillingness of the market to accept them as part of that global landscape. Right? Thirdly, I think, when we turn it around, that global market has an imaginary already of that other should be, and therefore selectively goes through what is available and chooses what is like, not what is different. So it has nothing to do with the difficulty of Arabic or the difficulty of, the Arabic language or the Arabic literary traditions. I think that the elements all seem to present themselves as primarily political.
When
Can I ask one question on that? I'm really interested in the Arabic language because literacy. Because here in Pakistan we encounter the Arabic, Arabic in a sense incessantly, but it usually presents itself in a kind of theological context. We talk about religion and Arabic comes when people are quoting things in Arabic, but we have basically no knowledge at all of contemporary Arabic discourse. And what I've wondered about is part of the reason for this that the way in which Arabic language culture meets the world is, like in most places, is that intermediation happens where there's the most money. So in England, in London for a long time, and now New York, and English language, and Madrid still for Spanish, even if, maybe Mexico City is the rightful home or whatever it is. Because the intermediation of the Arabic language world with the world is taking place effectively through the Gulf, because that's where the money is. And I would imagine that Arabic language writing, like writing everywhere, must be completely subversive and destabilizing to the narrative that the Gulf is creating, that we get blocked in a way, that the place where Arabic money resides doesn't allow Arabic culture to filter out to the world. Is that what's going on, or am I completely sort of being paranoid about this?
No, actually, thank you for giving the example. No, not at all. To go back to the idea of, east, west, on economic grounds, where the money resides. I think the Gulf has been trying to force its way on the literary map for the Arab region through its money. Again, there are several literary awards that have been created, the most prominent of which has been the Arab Booker Prize. I don't know if you have heard of it, but this has allowed the Arab novel to sort of be forced onto the global literary scene. So you get one sort of example every year of an Arab novel that is translated into, I think, 5 European languages.
The winner of the prize is translated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you get this token.
So is it always, sorry, I'm not clear about this, is it always a novel that was originally written in Arabic?
Absolutely.
And then, right, so
Absolutely.
it wouldn't necessarily be, say, someone like the Libyan writer Hisham Mato, who writes in English and then translates it?
No, this is an award that is given to an Arab writer writing in Arabic. And so you get you get a short list, which is interesting because then you have titles that surface on the international media, but then you also get the translation of the selection, the yearly selection. But despite that effort, checking is an interesting effort because you have a pan-Arab committee of jurists. So it's not like there are any strings tied to who is being selected. It's quite open, and the examples that have been selected are representative to a great extent to what is actually happening on the literary scene. But despite this effort, none of them, I think, have been reviewed by you, for example. Have you heard of anything?
Well, we have.
They continue to sort of be.
No, you're right.
Hidden away yet again. And that is the real question I think that one needs to ask. Why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why are certain literatures, even when available in English, marginalized?
Unless you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, going back to an earlier question from you and comments from others, I can speak from the experience of Bangladesh, where Bangla has a very strong, vibrant tradition. And there's a lot of Bangla writers and readers who are perfectly content with what the Bangla writers are writing and what they're reading. And most of these writers have had full-fledged career without any sense of, deep discontentment that they have not been discovered in other places and so on. So, and I imagine that, even in Pakistan, I know that there's a rich tradition of Urdu writing, and I'm sure there's many Urdu writers who are, really popular here and esteemed here, and readers and writers who are perfectly content with the dialogue they have between themselves, whether the rest of the world has had the privilege to eavesdrop on it or not. And I suspect that's the case throughout the world. So when we talk about this global novel, especially in the English context, we're talking about something very, also something that is on the margins of these internal discussions that are happening in every culture, and they have wheels within wheels as well. And in that connection, I mean, again, coming back to contradictions, I mean, I think, in my view, to the extent there's a global novel, we said that it has to fit a paradigm. The paradigm often is that, I'm sitting in my nice suburban Starbucks and I'm reading a book about a place that's far worse than where I live, and that makes me feel better. And it's worse because usually the men and men in power are horrible. The women have terrible lives. And the stories about a rebel or a rebellious woman or somebody who's been
always helps if it's a woman.
I mean, it's, I hope we don't get billed as a misogynist for saying this, but I mean, yeah, there's a kind of interest in the Western readership. But it can be a man as well, but they have to be hard done by. And they're either rescued by a Westerner, but now we've gotten subtler. It's not usually a white man coming in to rescue, it's the values of the white man that finally comes to rescue them. And as a result, what we have is, that they get rescued, and ultimately we have the vindication that humanity survives, that these horrible places also have humanity, and I have connected to that, so that reaffirms my humanity. And the problem with this formula is that people can write sort of mark to this formula, but that still doesn't lead to a bestseller. Del Freudenberger has written a novel about Bangladesh, but I don't think it's done well, because the prejudice is so funny, because the same prejudice that's driving to this kind of thing is now also working against that kind of writing, because there's those same readers sitting there and thinking, but I can read Tamima Anam, who's from there, so she must be authentic, which itself I think is problematic.
Yeah.
Just because someone's
talk
from there
about the issue of authenticity. So, but before I do, Samia,
Sure.
you wanted to come in and say something that, in response to Anise.
Triggered something in my head actually. This whole idea of the global novel again, it makes us all, from the South, direct our energies towards becoming part of that. When I really think, and I was struck by, this came to me as I was browsing in the book exhibit here, that my God, that we're also very local as people from the South, and that we have lost the networks between us. I would have been very happy to be asked, actually, to provide a list of possible books to be even displayed, not sold, from the Arab region, not just from Egypt. Just these connections to start taking place, and I think they're very interesting connections. And indeed, if I would like to propose an initiative Southern novel, that we have so much to talk about amongst ourselves, really, and that we're not doing that because of markets, because of that we've lost these connections. And I would fault us in the Arab region equally, because we too know so little about literature coming from Asian subcontinent, etc.
You're scribbling away, which means you've got some more things to say, but I'm mindful of the time, and I'm going to open the questions up to the floor, and if you're not feeling confident enough to ask any, I'll carry on asking some of my own. But I can see a hand going up in the front there. Yeah, that would help actually, because I can't actually see. Do tell us who you are if you would like to. But a question would be preferable to long statements, please. Thank you.
I'm Mohsin from Christian College. And my question is to the panel. In all this race for globalization or globalism, are we losing some grip on author and authorial skill? Also, if technology is helping us, like online work is coming up, how do you respond to that?
Anyone?
I'm going to beat down my fellow panelists and insist that I answer this question. They're fighting for the right to answer first. I think that I tend to think this whole question of global is concerned. I think that there is obviously much more linkage now, but it's a very long topic, so I don't want to go into detail. But I think that the format of reading on the internet, people are dealing with much more text than they did before. Pakistani kids are texting each other on WhatsApp, on Facebook, Twitter. So there's much more text in people's lives, words. But the way of reading is completely the opposite of long-form immersion, which is the way in which a novel has historically been read. And that is having all kinds of effects, I think, on reading and likely writing. I think young people today, when I go to campuses in Pakistan, but also abroad, Stanford, Yale, some of the best universities in America, the way they write is incredibly different than it was 10 or 15 years ago, at the best universities. So I think something is definitely happening, but that's an entire different panel probably.
It just reminds me of a question I wanted to put to you, Samia, as well. It's to do with technology, really. The writers that you were talking about in Egypt or in the Middle East generally, the ones who are concerned with who are on the periphery, you described them as writing peripheral stories and being on the periphery. I wonder whether there is scope for those people, as a result of technology, to have their voices heard in a completely different way, as bloggers who might then write novels that are based on blogs, as opposed to writing the conventional novel and going through the conventional route of being, published in a kind of the way that we are used to.
Go back to this idea of periphery. I don't want to be misunderstood. They are peripheral, writing from the periphery, but this is a periphery that has become the center. Right? I think that's very important. They are not peripheral at that level, because the periphery has become the center. That's one. Two, the idea that the relationship between, these peripheral writers and technology, and publishing and the literary world. And indeed, we have several examples of bloggers who produced novels, actually, as blogs that were then published by major Egyptian publishers, actually. And one of them, I think, was a candidate to be translated into English. Very interesting text entitled, and I was at Always, I Want to Get Married. And it's about this young woman, maybe you've heard of this. So that's in the pipelines, I think. It has been translated into English, yeah.
More questions? So, microphone's there. Great, thanks.
Just one question regarding something that you pointed out about authenticity. Especially after 9/11, you get the feeling, at least in South Asia, that there's this desire for the novelist to stand in for what the journalist or the documentary filmmaker was supposed to do and provide, like, you know, what makes these people tick. And especially, like, wherever the US Army lands a few years later, there's a spate of novelists who are writing about the experiences of that. And so there's almost, at least in Pakistani writing, you felt that there was a straitjacket that you have to have big ticket politics in the narrative, otherwise you're not going to get published. Is that a fair assertion to make?
To the Pakistani novelist on the panel, perhaps.
Having never written about politics in my own novels, it's difficult to answer this question. No, it certainly seems to be the case that lots of Pakistani novels written by people connected to Pakistan have dealt with these sorts of themes. It's also the case that in my own work I would hope to try to subvert what I think the expectations around those things. But whether I succeed is, I don't know. But the other question other thing embedded in your question is there is a notion that art and politics are two separate things, should be thought of as separate things. Whereas for me, the position that my art or anyone's art is apolitical is actually a political position. And very often the political position embedded in that is a satisfaction and reinforcement of the status quo. So I think that what you find is yes, there's been a lot of writing in Pakistan that has been responding to this kind of thing. And yes, it's dangerous. You know, I mean, as a novelist myself, I know when I wrote my first novel, Mohsin, about a bunch of drug-using Lahoris. It didn't have anything to do really with global politics. People said, oh, this is so irrelevant to you. And then I wrote my second novel, The Russian Fundamentalist, and people said, now you're pandering to the official Western conception. And then I wrote my third novel, and in a weird way, I wrote my third novel, and it's interesting what Denise was talking about specificity. I wrote my third novel with no names to sort of muzzle myself. To say, look, I don't want to be talking about Islam or Pakistan or whatever. I don't want to, how can I really look at what I'm saying without using stereotypical shorthand? I will describe something. I won't say it's a mosque or it's a Muslim. And then I'll see what it does and what it acts like. And that's my own way to try to fish out of myself some kind of honesty and disarm whatever internal pandering maybe is going on inside me. Every writer has their own way of responding to this thing. But that said, while doing this, I wanted to also, without having any names in the novel, I wanted to write something that was incredibly specifically about law. So it was could be anywhere, but actually is exactly here. And I think for me, the reason for doing that was to say, why is it that a novel about Paris can be the universal novel, or that New York can be the universal city? Why can't Lahore be the archetype of the city of Canada? Maybe more cities are more like Lahore than they are like New York or Paris. And so I wanted to kind of assert an equality of universality, that you can write about this place and treat it like it's universal, just like you write about any other place. But these are all my personal reactions to what you said. I think it's different for every writer, but I think the issue you've talked about is something that many of writers I know feel and are grappling.
I'm being told we can only have one more question. I thought we had 15 more minutes because we started late, but the next panel's waiting to come on. So, whoever's got the microphone, you're on.
Is that me?
Go ahead, you're talking.
Hi, I'm Mohsin from Canada. So You mentioned the expectations of Western viewership and the privilege of Western critical circles. And I was curious what you guys think South Asian markets can do to challenge those so that we don't have that problem of Western privilege dominating our writers, or not, but being an issue regardless.
Sure. Like somebody like N+1, they're also actually criticizing that, oh, it tries to fit this paradigm, therefore it's inauthentic. Conversely, the same work will often in the same country that it's originating from also be viewed with suspicion because it's, quote, pandering to the West and it's inauthentic. I think the real problem is the expectation of authenticity. When we say that a writer is from this place, therefore they should be able to comment on it, or because they're living abroad, they can't be authentic, or because they're writing in the local language, then they must be more true. Those are actually imposing stereotypes and prejudices, and the novel is a deeply subversive form. So to me, the really important thing when I look at a piece of work is if I can start sensing or smelling that it's trying to actually seek authenticity of content, I start to lose interest. What I look for is authenticity of form. And I think the works that have traditionally succeeded, the Borges, the Kafkas, it could be placeless, something like a castle, but it goes on resonating because at a formal level of what the novel can do, it was authentic. And I think to you, my answer would be that we try to stay authentic to the form and not to this presumption that there is some authentic content out there that somebody with the right position, place of birth, language can access and others can't.
What a great way to end, and what a fantastic way to start the Saturday morning. Thank you all very much, and my thanks to Mohsin, to Hugh, Samia and Anis.